尊敬的各位领导、各位来宾、女士们、先生们，大家下午好。百年大党国际学术研讨会的圆桌论坛环节马上就要开始，请各位迅速就座。Ladies and gentlemen, the opening ceremony of the panel discussion will begin at 2 p.m. So please take a seat, and our event will start shortly.尊敬的各位领导、各位嘉宾，圆桌论坛即将开始。为了确保会议顺利进行，同时也为了保证您的收听效果，请将手机关机或者是调整成静音状态。Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start the panel discussion. To ensure the meeting runs smoothly, please turn off your mobile phones or set them on silent mode. Thank you very much for your cooperation. 尊敬的各位领导、女士们、先生们，大家下午好！欢迎来到百年大党国际学术研讨会的下午场，也就是圆桌论坛部分。Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. This is the panel discussion of international symbolism on the Communist Party of China's history of 100 years. 在上午的讨论中，我们可以说是聆听了许多知名学者和专家的意见。我们对中国共产党和中国的近代史以及中国的现状有了更加深刻的了解。那么在下午的 panel discussion 圆桌论坛环节，我们将听到来自更多领域的专家和学者对于当代中国的解读和对于共产党在过去100年所取得的成就所做出的一些见解。And in this afternoon's panel discussion, we will have political leaders, experts, and scholars, as well as entrepreneurs from various countries and regions. They're going to give us some in-depth exchange of ideas and discussions on the topics of development of China and what they think of the Communist Party. 那么受到疫情的影响呢，今年我们的论坛是不能请到所有的嘉宾来到现场，将通过视讯的方式参与我们的交流。我们现在先有请5位在现场做主旨发言的嘉宾在台上就座，他们分别是澳大利亚墨尔本蒙纳士大学前教授、香港大学法学院客座教授高礼文。And due to the COVID pandemic, we are not able to have all the guests to be presented here today. Some of them will speak to us through videos, but 5 of them will be seated here and give us a live speech. And first of all, let's invite Mr. Richard Cullen, former professor of Monash University, Melbourne, and visiting professor of Faculty of Law, the University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Mr. Cullen. I believe this is your seat. Thank you. 还有全球未来研究所创始人及 CEO 陈子俊先生。Mr. Chandran Nair, excuse me for my pronunciation, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow. Please take a seat. This one. 香港兰桂坊集团主席、民主思路荣誉顾问盛智文先生。Mr. Alan Zeman, Chairman of Lan Kwai Fang Group in Hong Kong. Welcome. I think in the middle. Thank you. 还有香港大学政治与公共行政学系副教授、中国制度研究中心总监、全国港澳研究会理事严小俊先生。Mr. Yan Xiaojun, Associate Professor of Department of Politics and Public Administration of the University of Hong Kong and Director of Research Hub on Institutions of China, the University of Hong Kong. Also, he's the council member of Chinese Association of Hong Kong and Macau Studies of China. 我们还有一位是香港岭南大学高级研究员刘淑勇先生。Mr. Liu Shuyong, Senior Research Fellow of Lingnan University, Hong Kong. Please take a seat. Welcome. Excuse me, the mask. OK. 下面我们就快速的进入我们今天的圆桌论坛的环节。Now we're going to go straight forward to the panel discussion session. First of all, please let me introduce Mr. Richard Cullen, former professor of Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, and the visiting professor of Faculty of Law, the University of Hong Kong, to give a speech. 有请澳大利亚墨尔本蒙纳什大学前教授、香港大学法学院客座教授高礼文先生发言。Please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Distinguished guests and friends, I'd first like to express my thanks for the invitation to speak at this forum meeting marking 100 years since the founding of the Communist Party of China. I'd also like to take this opportunity to express my deep gratitude to both Hong Kong and to China for the exceptional opportunities they've each offered me since I first came to work here almost 30 years ago. In this short presentation, I've called it Governance That Works. And my aim is to provide a brief overview of the journey to where modern China finds itself in 2021, the role of the CPC government in shaping that outcome, and the crucial importance of, to me, two aspects of that mode of governance: detailed, intelligent planning and distinctive, rational problem solving, with a brief reflection at the end on how important these aspects are for us here in Hong Kong. Let's just look back briefly over the last 100 years. In 1921, the population in China was about 450 million. The population of the USA was about 110 million at the same time, so about 25% of the size. The GDP of the US 100 years ago, according to one OECD study, was over 600 billion US dollars using adjusted figures. The GDP of China at that time was about 250 billion US dollars. Per capita income of the US then was about 10 times what it was in China. Today, the population of China is still around 4 times larger than that of the US, and based on purchasing power parity figures, however, Nomura Holdings estimates that China's total GDP overtook that of America in 2017. According to the Centre for Economics and Business Research in the UK, China's economy is set to exceed the size of the US economy using straight GDP figures in 2028. These remarkable improvements in China's economic standing are even more striking when we consider a shorter time span. Let me explain a little bit why this is so. After the First World War and the Second World War, the US grew at a prodigious rate. Amongst all of the major belligerents in both cases, its home economy was left comparatively unscathed. China, meanwhile, endured over several decades both a terrible war in China arising from unprecedented Japanese aggression and a massively destructive civil war. After 1949, recovery remained slow. The Korean War began, and the possibility of the Civil War recommencing was real. China internally grappled with major tensions over primary economic and political policies. 2 extended periods of damaging turmoil were endured during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Just over 40 years ago, however, with the commencement of the open door policy, as it's called, China reset its economic policies firmly and clearly. Let's now consider the position as it was around about 1980. World Bank and IMF figures confirm that in plain GDP terms, the US economy was by 1980 almost 14 times larger than that of China, based again, of course, on a population only 25% of that of China's population. So what we can see is that in less than 40 years, China's total economy overtook the US economy in 2017 using the PPP measure, and it may overtake the US economy based on raw GDP figures within 50 years, that is by 2028. These outstanding achievements are unprecedented in world history, most of all because as they've unfolded, China has lifted over 800 million people out of abject poverty. The editors of a recent 700-page study of post-1978 China post-1978 published by the Australian National University in 2018, put it this way, and I quote, "China's reform and opening up is in the process of delivering to 1.4 billion Chinese people the fruits of the most consequential socio-economic change and institutional innovation in human history." The same study observed that between 1978 and 2018, the total GDP in China rose around 45-fold. The Economist and other publications have noted how the PRC has expanded its middle class at a remarkable rate, and the World Bank figures show how China has been responsible for at least 70% of the total world poverty reduction over the last several decades. According to a 2013 assessment arising from the US-based Pew Survey of Global Attitudes, 85% of Chinese people were very satisfied with the country's direction, compared at that time with 35% of US citizens. More recently, a long-term comprehensive PRC study was published by the Ash Center, based at Harvard University, and a 2020 survey was also published by the China Data Lab at the University of California, San Diego. Both of these assessments confirm that the high levels of confidence indicated in the Pew survey have been maintained. Given the steadily rising standards of so many and the extraordinary reduction in abject poverty levels, it's not surprising that China is a state which enjoys comparatively high continuing levels of general, unassuming confidence and optimism. China has managed to rebuild itself fundamentally based on its most abundant resource, its own population. It has traded and educated itself to be where it is placed in the world today. China has taken best advantage of the Western developed world trading system, that is true, but every other large impoverished nation has had the same basic opportunities, in a number of cases blessed with natural resources China can scarcely dream of. Only China has managed this astonishing feat of real growth and to the benefit of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. As China's opening has gathered pace, the PRC has encountered a huge range of problems, including severe challenges related to housing, education, medical services, environmental damage, governance, transparency, corruption, the legal system, public finance, and very high debt levels. For example, extraordinary progress has been made in addressing such problems, but both old and new challenges in these areas persist within an economically transformed China, and today they are accompanied by rising public expectations and deep concerns about a large ageing population. All these achievements are the product of immense hard work encompassing all of China's huge population. However, they've required fundamentally effective methods of political, economic and social organisation on a scale never before seen in world history, as the ANU survey notes. A book published in 2018, Regions in an Area of Globalisation, looking at China, shows how using a robust regional case study analysis, how complex development plans are forged, applied, evaluated, adapted and applied again in China. Not a few Western commentators assume that successive 5-year plans and other such policy documents are largely ceremonial. This book, however, shows the many ways in which they have shaped long-term positive developments. Plans such as these are not perfect, of course, but overall they work and work very well. The studies in the book confirm the central importance of continuous, highly informed detailed planning, accompanied with continuous, rational problem solving. It's very easy, as I just noted, to dismiss this sort of planning, and this is commonly done, indeed, in the West. But in fact, we can see today an unfavourable consequence of the absence of such planning, a rather remarkable one. The new US President, Joe Biden, has proposed spending over US $4 trillion on rebuilding the American dream. This is on top of combined spending since 2020 of around another $4 trillion US to help the US cope with its own manifest mishandling of the COVID pandemic over many, many months. In total, this is more than 1/3 of annual GDP in the US in extra spending. So far, it's all of it significantly unfunded. Even more striking is the remarkable absence of any long-term comprehensive planning designed to ensure effective coordinated spending of these huge sums. It seems that the overall plan, such as it is A, to identify certain pivotal problems, relying regularly on comparisons with China to indicate lagging US performance, and B, to shovel huge amounts of borrowed money at the problems. Let me conclude by briefly observing how vital this combination of long-term planning and rational problem solving has been for the HKSAR. The crucial long-term plan for Hong Kong, created by China, which has fundamentally shaped the contours of the British Joint Declaration, Sino-British Joint Declaration, and more importantly, the Basic Law, is of course the remarkable one country, two systems formulation. One country, two systems has on occasions been subject to extreme stress testing. In mid-2019, we experienced an exceptionally violent and destructive insurgency in Hong Kong. It spun off from a series of major protest marches and lasted for many months. The level of violence and destruction during the insurrection grew so intense that many in Hong Kong, myself included, what may become of the HKSAR. The central government in Beijing chose to watch and observe and ultimately deal with these grave threats to fundamental stability once basic order was re-established by relying on essentially legal means, the new national security law and recent electoral reforms, both of which have been applied within the one country, two systems framework. There's no question these are radical reforms to the broad Hong Kong legislative framework, but they are considered and measured reforms. They are above all designed to, one, ensure that an insurrection such as we experienced in 2019 cannot happen again. Two, to reform and recast the basic political foundations in Hong Kong to protect one country, two system. And three, to ensure that the HKSAR is well placed to make the very best of its future within China. What we've experienced in Hong Kong in response to the immense challenges generated in 2019 is the crucial application of rational, complex problem solving set within a primary overall plan, one country, two systems. That same experience also confirms the acute observation of the British philosopher John Gray, who argued almost 20 years ago, if you want to be free, you need first to be safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cullen. I think you mentioned a very interesting thing, that a book about China was published in 2018. If it is published this year, I think lots of its conclusions or descriptions will be changed, because we haven't seen something like this before in, I don't know, in 100 years or 500 years. An unprecedented global pandemic hit the earth, and I think it changed a lot of people's perceptions about the world, about China. And I remember the New York Times has a headline that is very interesting. It says, the COVID-19 hasn't become China's Chernobyl, as many people would expect. It has become America's Waterloo. which is quite interesting. I mean, the pandemic is still going on right now, so it's very hard to see how far it will go and how much deeper its impact will be. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's early days yet, but I'm sure that the lessons coming, especially from the COVID pandemic, are going to be crystallised and become more clear. The way that China responded, notwithstanding controversies at the outset, but let's remember, China was the first mover. China was the first that had to deal with this problem. I suppose one way of thinking about this, to put it sort of into figures, is if China had reacted to COVID the way that America reacted to COVID, the death toll in China would be around about 2.5 million people. And it's not because they did a much better job. But there'll be a lot of argument about this, and that's good to see.
Yes, it's an event that is still going on. Anyways, thank you very much, Professor Kulim. And now may I have Mr. Pasquino, Senior Fellow of CNRS France and Professor of Department of Politics, New York University, the US, to express his view through video. Please.
Created 100 years ago in Shanghai in a house located in the French concession. And it is with the German Social Democratic Party, one of the oldest still existing political party in the entire world. In its long history, it underwent inevitably a number of transformations, shaping in a relevant way evolution and deep changes in the most populated nation in the world. In my short remarks, I'll focus on the last period of this extraordinary travel, which from the point of view I'm familiar with, meaning political and constitutional theory, and which is at the same time remarkable, but not yet entirely clear, at least to Western observers, especially to those who were familiar with the China of Mao. I don't need to remind the public of this meeting what both China's leaders and citizens have been able to achieve in economic development since the governance of Deng Xiaoping. No doubt, as the great economic historian Alexander Gershengorn wrote many years ago, Deng's China once abandoned the Soviet economic model, was able to take advantage of its economic underdevelopment to realize a huge leap forward. The 700 and perhaps more million people who were rescued from poverty is definitely the greatest and astonishing achievement by the party in the last decades. In a sense, more surprising is that the party was able to survive and to make his modernizing transformation after the collapse of the Soviet system, and to give birth to a new regime that we still need to understand closely. By we, I mean Western politicians and political scientists, as well as the Chinese themselves. It may be true in China too that it is too early to describe the specific nature of a political system which has no equivalent in the past and in the present. Nonetheless, I'll try to say what I understand and with which question I'm struggling in my effort to explain, at least to myself, the nature of contemporary Chinese political and constitutional order. A first point, the easiest one to grasp, is that the party was able to change largely its ideology and possibly its structure without denying or rejecting explicitly its past. The abrupt and radical abandonment and rejection of its political past after 1989 did not help at all Russia to improve either the regime or the life condition of its citizens. Then instead promoting a quite radical transformation of Chinese economy, often speaking with a big picture of Mao behind his shoulders. A remarkable example of Chinese old wisdom, which let me think of the English culture that invented modern parliamentarism, never abandoning its traditional monarchy. It just transformed monarchy in a dignified and ornamental piece of the system. Another important change that I personally experienced during my visit in China was the continuing transformation of the identity of the party from a political actor, the authority of which was rooted in the revolutionary ideology and political experience of Mao, into a meritocratic elite able to govern the country in the interest of the large majority of the citizens, and nobody can deny that. Here, I can touch upon this topic in meritocracy only in passing. Still, I want to spend a few words about this important but ambiguous and controversial question. Meritocracy is definitely part of all of the great culture and civilization and of their ideal of a good government. The ancient Roman Republic, for instance, was proud of a mechanism crucial in selection of the individuals exercising public authority, a mechanism called in Latin cursus honorum. This expression referred to the rule according to which to access political function, a Roman citizen had to go through a number of inferior public magistracy, meaning public functions, to show its ability to govern in public interest. The citizens, even from an aristocratic family, could not jump directly to the most important governmental position without going up step by step and showing his qualities and capabilities to pretend more relevant roles. This model is somehow alive and I believe encouraged by the Chinese party as to the internal career. In a very old and linguistically high sophisticated culture as the Chinese one, meritocracy was strictly connected with the general system of competitive exams. Consider, moreover, something a little less well known. When the representative government was introduced in the United States at the end of the 18th century, the mechanism of elections to select the member of public authority was chosen because the founding fathers believed, following the classical Aristotelian doctrine, that the elections were the best mechanism to choose an elite, meaning the member of the community more able to govern political community in common interests. The equalitarian dimension introduced later on by the universal suffrage, mostly in the 20th century, overcame and obfuscated the original conception, which stressed instead the meritocratic elitist element of the electoral legitimacy. Unfortunately, in contemporary Western societies, elections seem to present nowadays some worrisome aspects. Contrary to what James Madison in America and Emmanuel Sieyès in French used to think, it may happen not only that the voters select someone like Angela Merkel, but also leaders like Berlusconi or Trump, whom not I, but the British magazine The Economist did not hesitate to qualify as not fit to govern. Meritocracy, I said, is a complex and somehow ambiguous concept, but in China, like in Europe and in the United States, no sensible person wishes to be governed by incompetent leader or able only, like some people are, of being re-elected to keep their power position. There is no doubt that both China and the West need competent government and governmental leaders. That the elections or the guarantee of such a good choice become, unfortunately, an uncertain outcome, at least in my generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pasquino. 下面有请全球未来研究所创始人和 CEO 陈子俊，马来西亚学者，他来发言。Next, may I invite Mr. Chandra Nail, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow, please.
Thank you. Thank you. So maybe it's my culture, but I feel I should stand up and be respectful for the audience. So allow me to stand up and say a few words. Because if I sit down also, I feel a bit cramped. So let me start by saying that most of what we've heard today I found very enlightening. We've heard about the great achievements of China under the CCP. We've heard also about the challenges that China will face as it's confronted with different ideological systems, the tensions with the West. What I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about is how do other people who are not in the Western world feel about China, and what obligations and responsibilities does China have, and the opportunities that the CCP has to address some of these concerns. So that's where I would like to come from. So before I get there, you might say, well, what does this guy know about China? Why is he interested? Well, I've been living in Hong Kong for a long time. Not as long as Mr. Zeman here, but long enough. But really, I come from Southeast Asia, from a very small country called Malaysia. My parents are originally from India. When I was brought up, when I was growing up, the Vietnam War was raging in Southeast Asia. As members of the Commonwealth under the British Empire, and under the influence of the American influence, etc., I was brought up fearing the communists. Everything I heard was, those nasty communists are going to get us. So those of you who know history will know that there was something called the domino theory, that as soon as Vietnam fell, aided by the Chinese, then they would come to Thailand, they would come to Malaysia and sweep across Southeast Asia, and we'd all be living under those conditions of the horrible communist Chinese. This is true. This is what my whole teenage years were about. Then, as life goes on, I went to Africa for a few years as part of my work and studies, etc. And I noticed, and I landed in Africa in the 80s, where the liberation wars were at their peak, particularly in Southern Africa. And I noticed that everyone who was fighting for liberation in Southern Africa, from Angola to Mozambique to Namibia to Zimbabwe, were all called communists. And they were all supported apparently by nasty communists, Chinese, the Soviet Union, the Cubans. This made me realize essentially the word communism and communists were aligned with essentially a narrative to demonize people who were fighting for freedom. That anyone who was fighting for freedom against imperial powers were essentially called terrorists or communists. And in my own country, we had what was called a communist insurgency, which is essentially an insurgency led to essentially dismantle British colonial rule. So thereby I understood that there was an ideological obsession by demonizing countries. And today we see how China is being demonized. Long story short, that led me to a great interest in this country called China. I was sitting in Africa for the first time. Being brought up in Malaysia, of course, I was very close to Chinese culture. I learned to eat with chopsticks and char siu pao and all of that at the age of 3. So Chinese weren't alien. But to meet real Chinese people from the PRC, that was different. So I got to meet some of them, I got to study with some of them, and I began to understand different things, and I wanted to get to know a lot more. That brought me to Hong Kong, and then the rest is history. Over the last 25 years being in Hong Kong, I've had the privilege of having a front row seat to, I think, the greatest revolution in terms of economic and social change in the 20th and 21st century. The transformation of China and all the numbers we've heard about the number of people, unprecedented in human history. I've also had the privilege of traveling widely across China, from Yunnan right through to Qinghai, right through to Gansu province, to Hebei, most parts of China. I've traveled on trains, railways, camels, etc. And I have some very close friends in China, both Han Chinese, but also, interestingly, from the minority groups, from the Muslim community, and also very close friends to the Tibetan communities. And I've begun to understand a lot more about what's going on in China in the last 10 years or so. So now I'd like to then talk about what does China have to do going forward. China is very big. And what I understood is that as China grows, the ideological media war that we're all witnessing every day, every time you turn on the news, etc., suggests that this war is not going to cease very quickly. So there is need for a campaign of a Chinese softer approach, which President Xi talked about only, I think, 2 weeks ago, called for a softer approach. I think amongst friends, I can say that I was speaking to someone very senior from a large Chinese tech company, you can guess, and she was saying to me, you know, we Chinese are not good at PR. I think we can say that among friends, right? So China needs better PR. And I think these are the areas where China needs to address the concerns of the smaller, because everyone's looking for China to fall and slip and be demonized. And in that regard, I think China has both the ability, for all the reasons we said the CCP acts by searching for the truth from the facts, the ability to get organized and mobilized, and the ability to serve the community and increasingly the global community. Because China is so big, there is no denying that China's rise has impacts all over the world. We would be foolish to not acknowledge that. Those impacts can be viewed through different lenses. All of us can see those differently. But I want to go back to Southeast Asia from where I come from. So China has a long history of association with populations in Southeast Asia. Many of us do not demonize China as it's demonized in other places because we understand. But I think China must reach out to understand the concerns because it's so big. So we've heard most of the day people talk about what China needs to do inside, and it's done a fantastic job, unparalleled. Now the challenge is, what does China do to help the world both respect it, attain its position as a global leader, and ensure its detractors do not find ways to demonize it? And in that, I see three things that China needs to do in terms of both taking that responsibility, that obligation, but its ability to change. And in that, I think we are now entering the post-Western world. And China is leading that. The troubles we had in Hong Kong, I've written about this, I've said, is the orphan, or Hong Kong became the orphan child of the birth of the post-Western world. And the post-Western world will be looking very differently as China expands. But none of us want to see China misbehave or behave in ways that large powers can. And I think China is very conscious of it. So here are three areas that I think China should really be very careful, seek good advice from its friends, and through the ability of the party to get organized, have a clear path. The first one is, as China rolls out the Belt and Road Initiative around the world, and we believe to help economic growth, not stifled by ideological beliefs that the World Bank, et cetera, used to impose. It needs to ensure that the development of the One Belt, One Road initiative is even and sustainable. What I mean by that is there's a lot of criticism in the world I inhabit in terms of development, economics, et cetera, that China is essentially pushing ahead unconcerned. A lot of this is, of course, exaggerated, as we all know, but China needs to be very careful. In that regard, on the sustainable front, China needs to look at the whole issue of coal-built power plants, et cetera, and particularly the nature of resource utilization in these countries. The accusation that those who detract from China will accuse it of is that it expands and it needs resources, it will extract from other places. China needs to be very careful because then it'll be accused of being a new imperial power. And that too needs to be very carefully adjusted. So one is One Road, One Belt, very important, can alleviate poverty around the world, et cetera, but needs to be done very carefully because China is so big. And its agents of change outside need to be well informed about this threat. So that's one. The second one is, of course, I think China will play the leading role in terms of addressing the existential threat of climate change. There is no doubt about it. Of course, if you listen to the G7, et cetera, there's just criticism of China. But those of us, and I come from a science background and environmental background, that the steps China has taken are extraordinary. China should lead the world, and hopefully in partnership with the US and Europe. And that will fundamentally change. But that's also linked to my first point about even development and sustainable development through One Road, One Belt. I don't think that's discussed enough because that's a real threat if China doesn't follow through. And I think I'm very, very reassured when people keep saying the CCP listens. And if there's anyone who has access to the top leadership, please, this is very important. The third thing is how China essentially impacts resource utilization around the world. And so one area that will give you a great example, if any of you have not read it, go and read a foreign policy article last week around the Chinese fishing fleets around the world. It's hugely exaggerated in some parts in terms of what it accuses China of, but we can't run away from the fact that the Chinese fishing fleets are huge. They're the largest in the world. The fisheries resources of the world are threatened. Here again, I think China can lead with the CCP saying at a policy level, we do not want to decimate the fisheries around the east coast of Africa, et cetera, been accused of a new form of colonization. And the Chinese government, I believe, can do this. But because it's so large, it has commercial interests or private interests going around the world, damaging the image of China. So I think fisheries is one area where China must take steps and lead its initiative. And there are already established forums like the Marine Stewardship Council, et cetera, that China can. But if you read that article, you will see how easy it is for China's interests, for resource needs, et cetera, can be completely used to make China look some sort of evil empire. So that's very important. And the last thing I want to say in finishing off is, China must lead the world through this very difficult time of the creation of a framework for a post-Western world. The whole sort of rules-based Western system is essentially past its sell-by date. We can all criticize it in different ways, but there's an inevitability that we are moving into a new rules-based order. It's not led by the West. This will be a struggle for the next 20 years, and China, for all the reasons we've discussed, can be part of it. But it needs to bring the other smaller countries together with it and essentially also not simply be driven by its self-interest. So to finish off, I think, in terms of the next 100 years of the CCP, the Chinese system, would be to address these issues in a way that understands that smaller nations will be essentially worried if China doesn't essentially spread its influence in an even way. We all know when large countries arise, there are ripple effects. And that, I think, the CCP needs to be very conscious of. And to do that, my main point is there needs to be, I think at the highest level, they understand. But right across China, particularly in business interests, et cetera, there needs to be a mindset shift. And there too, I think the CCP can influence mindsets so that companies that go into Southeast Asia, go to Africa, et cetera, are very conscious of their obligation and the reputation of China if they behave badly. And this, I think, is something that is not discussed enough. And therein, I'll finish off by saying, I think it was so important that President Xi 2 weeks ago said, we need to be smarter in telling our story, but we can't just have propaganda. We need to follow the facts. We need to follow the science, and then we need action, and we need a softer approach. So those would be my points to share, and to wish the Chinese government and the CCP 100 more years of even sustainable development and caring for the rest of the world in partnership with the great powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandra. Speaking of the relationship between the West and China, I'm a news anchor, so 2 days ago I was reporting on one piece of news. The NATO listed China as the systematic challenge to NATO for the first time in history. Well, China is probably the furthest country from the Atlantic Ocean, and they have to do that. And I remember the Secretary of NATO spoke to the media before entering the meeting room, say, China is not an enemy or a competitor. But after the meeting with Biden, everything changed. Anyways, I think pointing fingers is always easy. You said when you grew up, communism is never a good word. Yes, that's interesting, because when I was growing up, capitalism is never a good word.
Exactly.
It's even worse than Kuomintang, whatever. Yeah. I was growing up in Shenzhen, and when I was 16 or 17, we had an English teacher from America, and he's very disappointed, because he said, this is not what I think about China, this is Los Angeles. So, well, he's from Tennessee, so I understand now. Anyways, I think the more we travel, the more we learn, the more we find about the misunderstandings between different people.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just say, I think we need to understand why the G7 and all of them behave the way they do. The anxiety of, and I know it's cliched to talk about the Western Alliance, but for want of a better word, I'll call it the Western Alliance. I mean, the anxiety I understand. But with the greater, over the span of history, what we need to understand is that for the first time in perhaps 400 or 500 years, a Western civilization is confronted with the rise of a non-Western civilization. You have to look at history. So for 500 years, the world has known nothing but the domination of Western civilization over the rest of the world. We can talk about all the atrocities, etc., but that is the world in which Western democracies essentially have thrived on. To lose that dominance is very difficult. So I understand their pain, but it does not excuse the behavior of trying to hold back other countries like China. The question for me will be, how will China behave, which is what I talked about, and that's where I think the CCP's ideology, the Chinese culture, becomes so important so that they don't repeat those mistakes. But you've got to understand that the Western, the NATO and all of that is essentially an inability to come to terms with the loss of power. And that's fundamental to understand.
Well, thank you very much. That's an interesting topic. Okay, next, may we please invite Mr. Alan Zeman, Chairman of Lan Kwei Fong Group, Hong Kong, to give us a speech. Thank you. Okay. There's no sound.
Working now? Yeah, now we're working. Okay, on live. Okay, it's been a very interesting morning for everyone, and starting the afternoon. And I was sitting and listening to all the speakers and thought about what I could say and what I could talk about. Basically, for myself, I've been in Hong Kong for 50 years, I've seen the British under the British administration. But I thought I'd like to talk about, since this is the 100th anniversary of CCP coming up. I've been in China for 45 years. I actually had my first office in Changsha, Hunan, 45 years ago. And I remember one day, Zheng Qihua said to me, "Why did you choose Changsha of all places?" And I said to him, because I was a young man, I was at that time I had a trading company, supply chain management. We were exporting from different countries. And I looked at China, and that was the birthplace of Chairman Mao. And for a young man, I thought to myself, that's head office of China in those years. And so why not open up an office there? Well, if today's world is just so different, in those years, China was such a different place of what we know today. Things we take for granted today was so different in those years. There was limited food to eat. We stayed in the hotel. We had an office in the hotel. And literally, the breakfast was from 5:30 in the morning till 6:30, and then the chef would go home. Lunchtime was 11:30 to 12:15, and then nothing. And we used to come down in the morning for breakfast, and if you were a little bit late, we had to go into the kitchen of the hotel to open up the refrigerator. There was no food. There was nothing there, basically. So you learned about the scarcity of the old way of China that was not so long ago, but it really, really opened my eyes to how China changed. And in the evening in the hotel, electricity was very bad, used to come on and off. So the electricity used to go off maybe sometimes at 4:30, 5 o'clock, 5 p.m., what to do. So we used to play ping pong by candlelight. And that was just a real experience that really taught me about the difficulty, the hardships that China experienced in those years. In order to get to Hunan from Hong Kong, there was two ways. Either the train, which was 14 hours overnight, sitting on the hard seats with the PLA. If you were lucky, you could pay off someone, a conductor, and they had one sleeper car with two uppers and two lowers, and usually reserved for military. And used to smoke all night. If you got one, they used to smoke all night. So when you woke up, I had hair in those years, you'd wake up in the morning and your hair, your clothes, everything smelled of smoke. So it was very, very, very difficult. And the other way was the airplane. The airplane took 2 hours, Russian Ilyushin airplanes by propeller. No air conditioning. They used to give you a fan. The food was just a candy, no meals. They had a refrigerator in there. And it was just a totally different world. One time I came there, I was the last passenger on the airplane out of Guangzhou, and gave the stewardess my boarding pass, and she told me that your seat's taken, somebody's sitting here. And I played dumb Western face, Guaylo face. I don't understand. I didn't want to get off the plane because it was 14 hours on the train again. So all they did, she took necessity, the mother of invention. She took a small stool, put it in the center aisle, sit down there, no seatbelt, nothing. Today, I would never, ever do anything like that, but when you're young, you do a lot of crazy things, but you improvise. You did things in China, and you start to learn the difficulty that people faced. And things that we take for granted today, in order to make a phone call out of Changsha at the time. Today we have a mobile phone. You just pick it up and you call your friend or you call wherever you want. We had to book a telephone call 2 days in advance. And the operator just go from Changsha to Shanghai to Beijing, the old switchboard operator that they used to put the cable into the board. And so it really, you had to plan everything. Everything was totally, totally different. And technology, of course, was non-existent. There's not very many cars on the road. Today, of course, China is the #1 automobile place in the world. In those years, very, very limited cars. People didn't travel much. And then I watched over the years the changes that took place in China. And I did business in many, many different provinces. I love China because every city had a different culture. Although it's one country, but it's made up of so many different, basically, cultures. And that's what made it so interesting. And I found just looking at each part of China was beautiful. It was like traveling on a train. You'd look at through the window, and even though it was fields, it looked like, in my mind, like a painting. Just beautiful, just untouched. But the only thing was, doing business in those years in China was the bureaucracy. That can drive you mad. And also, in those years, the corruption was quite prevalent. I had offices in 36 countries around the world that I built. Hong Kong was my head office. So I had experience in dealing in many, many different countries. But in many of the developing countries in those years were quite corrupt because salaries were low and just people had to live. You learned what it was at that time. But I saw the changes that took place in China. All that changes. And suddenly in 1978, a short leader comes in to power, Deng Xiaoping. And he was a brilliant man. He was all brain, literally. Decided we need to open up China. We need to change things. And he presented a picture that China must change. I remember in those years, Hong Kong people were very, very nervous. Oh my God, we're going from British rule back to China. And people didn't know what to do. And Deng Xiaoping comes up with something. If a cat is black, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. And so suddenly he came up with one country, two systems. Don't worry, you'll have your system, everything will be okay. And so people started to relax because we could have our system. The big problem with the system was, in the history of the world, there's never been one country, one city going back from one country to another. And so there's no template for it. And so really when 97 came, it was like the Wild West. Everybody had a different idea of what Hong Kong needs to be. Young people didn't know, am I Chinese? Am I Hong Kongese? Am I British? Am I American? Because there's no template for it. And China at that time had hands off because they were not so familiar. No one was with one country, two systems. The problem that we made at the time was that every country needs to have national education. When I was growing up in Canada as a young man, every morning when I was in school, saluted the British flag and sang God Save the Queen. In US, you put your hand on your heart and you pledge allegiance to the flag. In China, of course, again, you grow up singing the national anthem. So everybody has an identity. In Hong Kong, unfortunately, we had no identity. Everything, one country, two systems. China had the idea that one country comes first. Hong Kong people had the idea that two systems comes first. Because I still say the majority of Hong Kong people have never been to China and have not seen the miracle. And not just Hong Kong people, but the rest of the world, the Western world. Very, very few people have been to China. And so they still remember the old days of communism. And that's been a huge problem that, that they haven't seen. And when Deng Xiaoping, I was there when Deng Xiaoping came to Shekau in Shenzhen, and it was all basically field farms. And he said, this is going to become a special economic zone. And I thought to myself, I don't know what he's talking about, but you know, how can Shenzhen be a special economic zone? Now, for those of you that have been to Shenzhen, it's unbelievable. It's one of the great cities in the world. It's the most dynamic city. It leads the world in technology. I believe it's further ahead than Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was the start of it, but Shenzhen has moved way beyond it. And so this was all because of China's opening up. And so when I was at the same time, I was in Shanghai at the time when Zhu Rongji was in power in 1991. And I remember standing there, and he was looking across the river and saying Puxi. We were in Puxi, and he's looking, and it's like he was looking across, and he's saying that Pudong is going to be the financial center of Shanghai. And I thought to myself, there's no way. Again, it's all farmland. But those of you that have been to Shanghai today, Pudong is incredible. All the tall buildings, the financial center, everything that they do, that's the power of China. That's why China has been able to move so quickly. And today, when I was experiencing the changes taking place, look at China, the airports in China. Every city, in the old days, we used to fly in, and the airports were old, and it was a different system. Today, if you look at Beijing Daxing International Airport, take it as an example, it's one of the most advanced airports in the world. Guangzhou has most passengers in the world. I mean, we just keep going on. I sit on the Hong Kong Airport Authority Board, and I can tell you, of course, we're very proud of our Hong Kong airport, but literally every city in China has airports. I went back to the US 5 or 6 years ago. I hadn't been there for many, many years. New York LaGuardia Airport hasn't changed. Los Angeles Airport hasn't changed. The infrastructure is falling apart. Still, the bridges are still the same as when I left them, the Midtown Tunnel. China's infrastructure is amazing. The life of the people got better and better over the years. That was something that I experienced. And so the CCP is actually celebrating its 100th year anniversary. The governance of China, especially, is really one of the most admired systems in the world as far as I'm concerned, because it's the most misunderstood system. But with 1.4 billion people, that system, when you have that many people, that system really works. Because in 40 years, no other system has been able to take 600 million people out of poverty, lifted 600 million people out of poverty, and created a strong middle class, which is double the size of the United States. And so they have spending power. The system has become the model, to me, the model for the world. Because now, after President Xi came into power, he cleaned up corruption, he did everything possible, had a vision for the country, the way forward, and his vision has been followed. And we can see he doesn't want to depend just on GDP by export for GDP. He's now going for domestic spending, so they don't have to rely on the US after all the problems that they had with tariffs, with the wars, with all that kind of thing. And then I look at the system in the US, which was before the American dream. Everybody looked up to the American dream. Today, I call it the American nightmare. The system actually is broken. The system, Western democracies as we know it, really does not work. It's not what we were taught. It's not what we envisioned. as other speakers have said, when I was growing up, I was taught communism is bad. But you know, China is communist, but it's socialist. Communism has changed. And it's not only socialist, but what China has, it has capitalism, which we see the top tier, like Alibaba, Jack Ma, we have Tencent, JD.com, all the giant companies now, Huawei, all the companies in China, which are all basically capitalist, but with socialist principles. And then on the other hand, you have the middle class and the lower class, which practices socialism. And that's really what has given the life for the 600, for people, brought them out of poverty and gave them a much better life in China. Today, the people in China have, as far as I'm concerned, because I have many offices in China, my staff live better than many people here in Hong Kong, and then better than most places in the world. The United States, for argument's sake, they have capitalism, which is the Republican Party, and just care about the top 3, 4, 5%. The rest of the population, the Democrats, are socialistic. They care about the middle class and the lower class. The lower class in the U.S. today are living in tents because nobody cares about them. The black population is still slaves in the United States. So that system does not work and needs a lot of adjustment. The problem that we face at the moment, of course, is the backlash of Western countries. As Chandran has said, the Western countries, democracies, worry about the rise of China. And that's something that is understandable. But if you go back in history, you look at the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, they all were on top at one time, and then things changed. The future for China is just immense. And I can tell you, the system of which President Xi has done, it's amazing. Then China's changing dramatically. And what really changed China, and I can see the changes of the people, 2 months ago, we had the summit between the U.S. and China in Alaska. And at that time, you had Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi that were there. In the past, the U.S. used to scold China for about an hour, usually, to tell them how their system was not good. They're worried about human rights. They're worried about Hong Kong, all the other things that they could put together. But at that time, the first time that I've ever seen Chinese leaders say, hold on a minute. Before you lecture us, let us tell you, look at your system. Fix your system first before you come and tell us what to do about our system. We're very proud of our system because our system really does work. And that's because of the Chinese Communist Party, the system that really has worked. And as we saw earlier, there was and after that, when they went back to China, the face, and I could see a change in all the Chinese people suddenly feeling very proud. In the past, I always felt a bit of inferiority of Chinese people towards Westerners because they always thought the Americans, the Western way was the right model. But I could see the change now that our model really, really does work. And in 2008, I saw the changes. I was so confident about China. I had a Canadian passport. I changed my passport to a Chinese passport. I had to give up my Canadian passport. So I was all in because I see the future. And the future is China. And I was proud to be Chinese by nationality, although I don't have a Chinese face. But inside, I'm Chinese. My passport, my nationality is Chinese, says Chinese. I always have problems when I go through borders. Thank you. Because usually the immigration official in the United States or somewhere else looks at me and says, you don't look Chinese. And I tell them it's a genetic problem. It's easier, easier to tell them that. But now, you know, the rest of the world is looking through China through different eyes. It'll take time. China needs the soft power in order to bring where people can see their system. China does not want to expand their system around the world. China's just happy, as we know, the Chinese Communist Party is the party of the people, and really cares about the people, cares about making their life easier. Everyone has opportunity for people who want to be capitalists and people who want to be socialist and you know, and really improving their lifestyle. And so that's why I look at the future of China, and I just see only bright things ahead for China. And since we don't have so much time, I see very bright things for Hong Kong alongside in the new patriotic people who will govern Hong Kong, and that's a whole other discussion, but I can go into that. I know we don't have enough time. But one thing I want to leave you with, that in the past, the East always looked to the West to get inspiration. In the next 10, 15 years, the West will be looking to the East more and more. So we can all hold our head up high, because going into the future, I can tell you, this is the place to be. And I tell all young people, the way I came out here when I was a young man and made my fortune out here, I tell all young people, if I had to do it all over again, I'd be in China today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zimmer. I remember President Xi Jinping during this year's the National Congress meetings. He was talking to some of the representatives. He said, nowadays, you young people go abroad, you really can see the world through a horizontal angle. Not like us. When we went abroad like 20 years ago, we feel we are so out of fashion. Like 我很土，我们很土. But nowadays the kids, they can choose to 平视这个世界, not looking down, not looking up. But all we want is just to look at the world on an equal, you know, fair angle. I think that's quite moving, actually.
It's very true. And I've always said, I have a slogan, travel makes you smart. The more you travel, the more you see other cultures and understand other countries, you come back home and you adapt some of the culture to your own culture, and it makes you stronger and stronger. And I've always known that. I always traveled as a young man because I had so many offices and understood the different cultures in different countries, and you can really appreciate what you have. And that's what one thing I hope everybody does, continue to travel.
Thank you. Also, you spoke of soft power. Last week, also, there's a very big meeting promoting international communication skills from top to the levels to everyone needs to learn how to communicate with others more peacefully, I think. Anyways, we have limited time, so let's move on. Next, we're going to have a video speech, and please invite Mr. John Ross, former Director, Department of Economy and Business Policy in London, UK, to talk to us via video.
Firstly, thank you very much for the honour to speak on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CPC. I want to explain that that is not just polite words, it really is an honour. I'd like to start by the fact I don't know how many people here have actually been to the rooms in Shanghai where the CPC was founded. Well, I have actually. And it's really rather inspiring because you see how few people were there at the origins, only really a handful of people. Yet within 28 years, these people had led a party which had created a new state. And 70 years after that, China has been taken, as I will outline, from one of the poorest countries in the world to the brink of being a high-income economy by international standards. There is very few examples in history of how ideas of a small number of people could be translated in such a short period of time into such a huge organizational force, with such consequences from the world. Okay. Obviously, people in China look at the question of the CPC fundamentally from a national viewpoint, and this is obviously correct, because the great pledge which the CPC made to China was that it would lead to the national rejuvenation of China. So I don't want to take away from that perspective at all, but I think it's also useful to make some international comparisons, because that gives you not merely an indication of what is the scale of the CPC's achievement, but I think it actually casts some indication on the national viewpoint itself. If we go back and see it, the way that I would see it is the following. In 1949, the CPC made a promise to the Chinese people. It said, if you adopt our program, our methods, and the path that we propose, the century of humiliation of China, which started with the invasions of the Opium Wars, will be brought to an end, and China will regain its place in the world, not as better than any other country, but with no other country being better than China. This I take to be the meaning of the famous words of Mao Zedong in 1949, the Chinese people have stood up. And these were symbolized, not to say, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong did not say, now we will have extremely fast economic growth, or now we will take revenge for all the crimes which have been committed against China during the last 100 years. This phrase, the Chinese people have stood up, meant exactly what it said. It meant that after a century in which China was subject to endless humiliations and incredible attacks, I mean, we should never forget that in the period between the first Opium War and the founding of the People's Republic of China, almost 100 million people died in China as a result either of direct effects of foreign intervention or indirect effects, civil wars, famines, and other things. This was an extraordinary suffering, anyway, that can be described of the Chinese people. And what the CPC said is, if you adopt our methods and our program that we propose for the Chinese people, this period will be brought to an end, and China and the Chinese people will regain their position as respected a nation as any other in the world. The only decisive conclusion that can be drawn after 100 years is that the CPC delivered exactly that promise. Indeed, I would put it very simply that the social and economic achievements of China since the founding of the People's Republic of China, which are of course led by the CPC, are the largest of any country in the whole of human history, and have improved the position of the largest number of people and the largest proportion of humanity of any country in human history. Those are very serious statements, and then this type of thing is not to be made as a rhetoric. So I'm going to really try to prove this, okay? Firstly, in the situation in 1949, foreign armies had trampled across China for a century. I did recently a program, one of these year review programs, and looking ahead, in which I said, for young people in China, sometimes don't realize how lucky they are, because foreign intervention and foreign threats for their grandparents, this was not a theory, was not a potential. For 100 years, foreign armies had trampled upon China, starting with the British, then with whole sorts of international organizations, international groupings, then with Japan, and this had been brought a stop to. Now, actually, I was very pleased to see that the young people of China did understand what an enormous achievement this was, because I said this had been brought to an end. And these words actually received more applause than anything else which I'd said, which I'd not quite expected. But they did understand what a gigantic achievement had been created by the CPC. Okay, so what I want to look at is look at some of the international comparisons that could be made on this. The first is China has achieved this economic and social step forward for by far the biggest proportion of humanity in human history. In 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. If you take the study by Angus Maddison, who's the world's leading expert on long-term economic growth and per capita GDP, he finds in 1949 there are only 10 countries in the world which were poorer in per capita GDP than China. If we go forward now, 71 years, and you took at it from the point of view of today, that is within a single lifetime, in just over 70 years, in a single lifetime, China has gone from almost the poorest country in the world to being, by international standards, on the brink of being a high-income economy. By China's domestic criteria, China has already achieved what it calls moderate prosperity. But it's probably simpler from the point of view of making international comparisons to take the World Bank's definition of a high-income economy. If you look at that, China will become a high-income economy by World Bank standards in either 2022 or 2023. But look at the scale of transformation that this means for humanity. At the present time, only 16% of the world's population lives in high-income economies. But China by itself is almost 18% of the world's population. So China becoming a high-income economy means that the number of people living in the high-income economies in the world will more than double. And this is not just a question of abstract questions of per capita GDP. We know that the economic development, it determines life expectancy, it determines the availability of education, it determines the availability of health, the availability of culture, and numerous other criteria for human well-being. So China will, in only 70 years, have gone from almost the poorest country in the world to doubling the number of people who are living in high-income economies. There is no other country in history which has ever achieved this. I could make you a few international comparisons. The first country which ever underwent rapid economic development was my own country, Britain, with the Industrial Revolution. At that time, Britain was slightly over 2% of the world's population. If we go forward to the next very major country to experience rapid economic growth, it was the United States after its Civil War. The United States at that time was slightly more than 3% of the world's population. If we go forward to what up until now has been the fastest and biggest example of rapid economic development, it was actually the Soviet Union after 1929, which was about 8% of the world's population. But China, when it began to undergo rapid economic growth in 1978, was 22% of the world's population, almost 3 times as much of humanity as any other country which had ever undergone rapid economic growth. This is literally an achievement without parallel in human history. Okay. What does that mean also from the point of view of the Chinese people? Well, economists know that the best overall indicator of social and economic conditions is average life expectancy, because average life expectancy takes all the good things, that is getting rid of poverty, good consumption, good education, good healthcare, good environmental conditions. It takes away all the negative ones, subtracts from the number all the negative ones, that is poverty, poor healthcare, poor environmental conditions, poor education, etc. And it gives you a single number, which is average life expectancy. Now, China, even before the 1978 economic reforms, underwent probably the greatest social miracle, except it wasn't a miracle, it was a policy, in human history. People sometimes want to present, why does Mao Zedong have such authority in China? Well, leave aside the question of national reunification and stopping national oppression. Average life expectancy in China increased by 31 years during the period between 1949 and 1976, the death of Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping, this is a gigantic human miracle, and you can understand if somebody leads you to live 31 years longer than at the beginning of the process, you're likely to feel really rather well disposed towards them. And I think, therefore, it's very important what Xi Jinping has said, that, of course, the two periods of China's economic development after 1949, which were taken from the first being from 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic, through to 1978 and the reform and opening up, and then from 1978 to present day, these are different from many points of view. They're different in method, they're different in policies. The CPC showed great adaptability, but both were gigantic periods of progress of the Chinese people. The first, as I said, was what I would describe as a social miracle. Average economic growth was satisfactory by most normal standards, but it was not super high. But the improvement in health, education, life expectancy of the Chinese people is the biggest of any major country in human history. And then, of course, in 1978, began what is the most rapid economic growth of any country in the whole of human history. From 1978 to the present day, the average growth of China has been 9.2%. No other country in human history has ever achieved such rapid economic development over such a long period of time. And this is not merely abstract, again, per capita GDP. It's not the, just concrete and steel. It's the fact that what this means is, for example, the average consumption of Chinese household consumption has increased by 1,800% since 1978. That is increased by 18 times. The next major country in the world after China is 900% in that period. That means that the average consumption, the average household daily meeting of needs of the Chinese average people has increased by 18 times in that period of time. If you look at poverty, China has very proudly, correctly announced in 2020 the elimination of absolute poverty in China. But again, I think it's useful to make an international comparison because the World Bank lays down an international standard for comparison of escape from absolute poverty. By that criteria, since 1978, China has lifted 853 million people out of poverty. That is 3 out of every 4 people in the world who were lifted from poverty. For every 4 people who were lifted from poverty in this period in the world, 3 of them were Chinese. This fact alone is enough to establish that China has made the greatest contribution to the development of human rights in the real meaning of that word of any country. And obviously, this was with the leadership of the CPC. Finally, some people tried to pretend, having all the data showing how incredible China's economic and social development is, they tried to invent things such, claim that social conditions are very bad. Well, we can judge this very simple again, because life expectancy is the most sensitive indicator of a country's overall social being. We know that per capita GDP is the single biggest contributor to this. Statistically, 73% of life expectancy is predicted by per capita GDP. But that still means that there are 27%, which is not accounted for by per capita GDP. And this is the effect of such things as the environmental situation, the health situation, the education situation, etc. So therefore, if you compare what you would expect a country's life expectancy to be, you'll find that for some countries it's lower than you would expect from per capita GDP. And in some countries it's higher than you would expect from per capita GDP. This is showing you that the overall social conditions are either better or worse than you would expect from the economy. For example, in the United States, you live 2 years less than you would expect from its per capita GDP. This is showing you the negative effect of various social conditions in the United States. In China, you live almost 3 years longer than you would expect from its level of per capita GDP. So again, this is showing you that the environmental conditions, the educational conditions, the social conditions are even better than the economic ones. Now, I don't mean by this, of course, just pretend there are no problems. China's achievements are so huge, there is no need to prettify them or exaggerate them or anything like that. They just have to be accurately stated. China still has to overcome certain of the problems which were created even by its very rapid economic development. If we go back 5 years, I know when I was living in Beijing that there were significant problems with air pollution, for example. These have got a lot better. China is now developing its own policies from the point of view of climate change. But nevertheless, what this data is showing you is that the environmental, educational, social conditions of the Chinese people are even better than what would be expected by the development of the economy. What led this? There's a simple explanation. It was, of course, the development of the CPC. All these statistical data are the way of showing that the CPC delivered the promise that it made to the Chinese people. That is, the Chinese people in 1949 decided to place their trust in the CPC and its methods and policies. And the CPC did not let the Chinese people down. It delivered what it was said it was going to do. And what did this produce? This produced the greatest improvement in the largest number of people and the greatest proportion of humanity in the whole of human history. That is what is the achievement of 100 years of the CPC. And that is why I'm both delighted and very honored to be asked to speak on this subject. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Ross. Now, may I have Mr. Vladimir Petrovsky, Chief Researcher of Institute of Far Eastern Studies, Russian Academy of Science, and member of Russian International Affairs Council, to deliver a speech via video.
I'm really happy to be with us today for our conference to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. I think this is really a historic event which we should celebrate together and consider the historic importance of this. As we celebrate this very special anniversary, we should consider that it is of the great importance not only for China, but really for the rest of the world. Keeping in mind that more than 70 out of 100 years of its existence, the Communist Party of China was a ruling Marxist party, and which is a remarkable achievement in itself. So, and to this extent, I think that the newest period of the Communist Party of China, which is, as you know, the period of openness and reform, should be specially considered to better understand what is really the importance of the CPC as a ruling party. And to better understand this, I think we should turn to the history of the second part of the 20th century and the first decade of this century, because, by the end of the 20th century, the future of socialism really depended on its ability and its capacity to reform itself. Which means that all those who were not able to do this, like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union, they unfortunately ceased to exist. But those who were able and capable to do this, like the Communist Party of China, they now are the winners. And now they show the example to the rest of the world, especially to the Marxist and left-wing forces. And I would like to spend a few words just to try to compare the Russian, or better to say Soviet and Chinese experience to this extent. You know that by the end of 1980s, both of our countries found themselves basically at the very same crossroad, but each chose different path. The balance of economic reforms and political stability is the essence of any kind of reforms, including in Russia and in China. And I still remember as I was young, how liberal-minded people in Russia who admired economic achievements in China under the rule of Chairman Deng Xiaoping at that time. After its 19th Congress, the Communist Party of China entered a new stage of the country development. We see that political system is being adjusted now, and the new generation of leaders, headed by Chairman Xi Jinping, is in place, and they set tasks for the party and for the country which must be solved. And actually, now we see that despite the negative impact of the coronavirus pandemic, China has successfully completed its 13th five-year plan. And by the last year, the country's GDP doubled compared to the year 2010 as it was pre-planned. And thus, another historic milestone was reached, and the Communist Party of China announced that a society of average prosperity has been built in China. And this is the age-old dream of the Chinese people, which has come true. The first task, of course, was to feed everyone, to take care of everyone, to save people from hunger, to provide a minimum standard of living. And first, China built a society of low prosperity. Now we have average prosperity, society which has been built, and soon we will see a completely new China with a large middle class that will express its political and economic interests. And so far, China will thus become a fully developed country, as it was pre-planned by the Communist Party of China. And I would also stress that one of the very essential parameters of the Chinese development model is its full compliance with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals until the year 2027, specifically the goals and objectives for reducing poverty. As Chairman Xi Jinping noted in the year 2018, over the 40 years of the period of openness and reforms, more than 700 million of poor people, according to the current UN standards, have successfully emerged from poverty, making up more than 70% of the total number of people in the world at this time, which means that China made a very significant contribution globally to reach this very important goal of the SDGs. China shows to everybody in the world that the so-called universal Western standards and values are not universal in itself. And we should keep in mind that each and every country should be able to take its own path of development. We know, of course, that the Communist Party of China is able to generate new ideas and new concepts, and the communication is drawn to a number of key provisions expressed by Chairman Xi Jinping, specifically the concept of the community of the common destiny, the concept of the socialism with the Chinese characteristics in the new era, the concept of building a moderately prosperous society, etc., etc. So we have the whole set of new concepts and ideas which have been very well accepted in the world, not only in China. And these provisions show that China is entering a very important transition period of its development. And it becomes more confident and more constructive global player in world affairs. Because why? Because the CPC leadership shows to the rest of the world that it is being confident in the correctness of the policy and course which has been chosen, meaning to build socialism with the Chinese characteristics. And everybody in the world sees the steady growth of Chinese economy, which is the better proof for the correctness of these concepts and these ideas. And let me stress again that the strength of China's example as a successful socialist power is very much important not only for the left-wing forces, the socialism, Marxist forces, but also to the rest of the countries with the development, with the emerging economies who are still looking for their model of development. So China maybe is the best example for them. The concept of the community of the common destiny of mankind put forward by Chairman Xi Jinping reflects the Chinese vision of Chinese vision of the global international politics, which should be more harmonious, more sustainable, more fair, and to this extent, Russia completely supports this concept. Actually, this concept reflects the vision of the new world, of the future new world, which should be a multipolar, more secure, with more efficient and more balanced global governance system. And to this extent, let me mention the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very good example of how it works. It's a very innovative concept and initiative, which, as we know, consists of two key elements, which is the Silk Road economic belt, and this is specifically important for Russia and the post-Soviet countries, those who belong to the Eurasian Economic Union, because our countries consider the cooperation and, as we call it now, the conjunction between Eurasian integration and the Silk Road economic belt. And of course, we see the maritime Silk Road of the 21st century. Moreover, we see the emerging ice Silk Road or polar Silk Road, which means the prospects of cooperation between Russia and China of how to explore the Northern Sea route in the Arctic. This Belt and Road Initiative can be presented as a kind of a global public good, as a platform of multilateral cooperation, corresponding to international rules, first of all, and then corresponding to the needs of national developments of those countries who wish to join. Now the Belt and Road Initiative is about 8 years old, and the experience of its practical implementation show that it has already played an exceptionally important role in the development of trade and economic cooperation in Eurasia and Asia Pacific and other regions. Because the BRI Belt and Road Initiative, based on deep and very much considered strategic planning, allows countries interested to participate to align their national development strategies with the Belt and Road Initiative strategy. And to this extent, Belt and Road Initiative is a unique initiative in the modern global economy and international relations, enabling various countries to co-develop and enabling for their long-term cooperation. And as more changes to be occurred in the economic structure, the promotion of structural reforms is very much important. The promotion of balance of supply and demand is very much important. Now we need to secure what we call the global chain of support and demand. And to this extent, we should consider the concept of resilience. This is important. We should consider the concept of resilience of Chinese economy, the concept of resilience of bilateral Russian and Chinese relations, and moreover, a resilience of the global economy as we finally will get rid of this coronavirus pandemic, hopefully soon. Just one example to show what is the perception of the Communist Party of China nowadays. Just an example from my country, in Russia. A couple of years ago, I was asked by a certain media agency, and they were asking each and every expert just one question. What will happen with the global economy, with the global politics in 100 years to come? And then they asked me, what will happen with the Russian-Chinese relations in 100 years? And then they asked me, do you think that in 100 years, the Communist Party of China will still exist? And my answer was definitely yes. Why? Because the performance of the Communist Party of China is good. It doesn't make mistakes. And the performance is especially good in terms of the concept of good governance, which is much more wider concept than ideology only or economy only. That means that the Communist Party of China perceives itself as a kind of a servant for people. And the idea is to better serve people's needs and in politics and economy and social life. And as soon as the Communist Party of China, as a leading power, is being able to serve these needs. It will stay in power forever.
Thank you very much, Mr. Petrovsky. 好，下面我们有请香港大学政治与公共行政学系副教授、中国制度研。
And next, we'd like to invite Associate Professor, Department of Political and Public Administration.
Associate Professor. And Macau Studies of China. Mr. Yan, please.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers.
在这儿呢，我也要感谢。
Today, it was a privilege to learn from the insight of my panelists here. This year marks the centennial celebration of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. I agree and echo my panelists that this is a very important occasion and also a very important event. I think to reflect on the 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party, we need to probably first of all understand the experiences of China as a nation state in the past century. What did China experience in the past 100 years, especially since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949? I think there are at least three major transformations. First, in the past 100 years, China has transformed itself from the poorest country in the world to the second largest economy. When the Chinese Communist Party held its founding Congress in 1921, China was probably one of the poorest countries of the whole world and was torn apart by foreign and domestic wars. But today, China is a leader of the global economy. But more importantly, I think the living standard of the Chinese people has risen to a new level. In 1949, and probably even in 1978, only a few people in China had private cars. But today, when we sit in a traffic jam in Beijing, we complain that there are just too many private cars in big cities of China. Secondly, I think China has also experienced a transformation under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party from a Soviet-style centrally planned economy to a socialist market economy, which is also a very successful historical event. The third transformation, I think, is China's transformation from a traditional society to a modern society. And this is an ongoing process. There have been other important transformations as well. For example, internationally, China has transformed from a once marginalized member of the global community and also a victim of Western colonialism and invasion to an increasingly important power on the international stage. So in my view, when we discuss transformation, we are reminded of the many kinds of transformation that took place in the past 100 years. And especially over the past 70 years under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and also in the newly found People's Republic in the Chinese history. My point here is that when we are reflecting on the broad transformation of China, we need to see this as an ongoing process, and also a process of trial and error. In a book I published in China in 2016, 5 years ago, I raised two concepts. The first one is the second miracle, 第二个奇迹, and the second concept is the learning regime, 学习型政权. I would leave the second miracle to later today. I think the learning regime is something that's very important when we are reflect on the past 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. If we call the Chinese regime as a learning regime, 学习型政权, then probably we can also call the Chinese Communist Party a learning party, 学习型政党. In my view, the central achievement of the Chinese Communist Party over the past 100 years, especially over the past 70 years, is to constantly and attentively learn how to govern modern Chinese society, which is a multicultural society in transformation that is full of wonders and surprises. In this learning and transformation process, the Chinese Communist Party has learned in many different fields. In the economic fields, I think the Communist Party is striving to make itself an effective and sometimes even magic maker of economic miracle. And this is the first sort of field of the Chinese Communist Party to learn. In the past 40 years of reform and opening up, we can probably trace it back to 1949 as well, that the Chinese Communist Party has persistently played as a realistic, adaptive, and successful planner, implementer, and regulator of the national economy. And also, the party is trying to adapt to an emerging new economy from the heavy industry-focused economy of the 1950s to a knowledge-based economy incorporating artificial intelligence in the 21st century. This is a huge transformation, but the Communist Party continues to learn. And also, as my colleague, Professor Zheng Yongnian mentioned in the morning, that the Communist Party also recognizes the increasingly modernized and diversified social interests, cultures, and minorities in society. But so this is sort of a learning process for the party to adapt itself to a multicultural and diversified modern society. And the last part of my presentation today probably is about why and what are the results of this learning process. In my view, probably this is something that my panelists have not mentioned this afternoon, is that I think the most important contribution of the Chinese Communist Party to China's development is the contribution of a national philosophy. And this national philosophy is the result of the Chinese Communist Party's learning in the past 100 years. I think there are at least 4 elements of this basic national philosophy that has contributed to China's success. I think the most important element of learning result and also the element of the national philosophy is a belief in that lagging behind leaves one vulnerable to attacks. 落后就要挨打. This is a long-held belief of the Chinese Communist Party since its founding in 1921, which came mostly from the party's learning of modern Chinese history. The belief in the causal chains between economic strength and the capacity for national self-defense lead to the Communist Party's unbreakable determination in economic development. And because only by building a very strong economy can China avoid a future invasion by a foreign enemy or the prospect of again falling prey to Western colonialism. This is a conceptual pillar of the China's economic and political success in the past 70 years. I think the second element of China's national philosophy, which is contributed by the Chinese Communist Party, comes from its learning about 150 years of Chinese modern political history, during which a modern state is gradually being constructed. And before the founding of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, China was in a state of disunity, or in Chinese we call 一盘散沙. Without a strong central government, without a unified political leadership and a capable governing apparatus, China can only achieve chaos and civil society, inviting foreign interference and invasion. So the Communist Party's, I think the contribution is to tell the Chinese people that a strong central government, a strong nation, and a central leadership is so important. Especially when we reflect on our achievements since 2012, the 18th Party Congress, National Party Congress, we can see that in these past 9 years, we have achieved a lot of achievements that we were unable to achieve in the past, and we solved many important issues that were unable to be solved in the past. And these took place under the leadership of President Xi Jinping. So we can see that a strong central leadership is so important for China's development. I think this is a very important element of the China's national philosophy, that a strong central leadership is so important. And the third element is, of course, as many of my panelists just mentioned, the peaceful rise, 和平崛起. Since its founding in the late 1940s, the PRC has become more inward-looking and willing to develop itself to domestic issues. Neither the party nor the state has been very interested in being a global policeman, just like the United States is trying to be, or a leader of the international communism movement. So peaceful development is something that is within the party's official rationality. The party insists once the Chinese state has done a good job of managing its own politics, economy, and society, and keeps the vast country stable, it has already made a very important contribution to global development and governance. So I think this is a very important element of the Chinese national philosophy as well. Last but not least, I think very important, or one of the most important contribution of the Chinese Communist Party to China's national philosophy is old Chinese saying, 实事求是, seeking truth from facts, which constitutes the basic philosophical ground of the Communist Party's entire ideological superstructure. This is a very pragmatic approach and certainly a very realistic operational principle of a ruling political party. Like a person, the party at 100 has passed the time of rebellious youth and revolutionary hysteria and has become more rational, cool-minded, and has stopped being overly ideological. The Communist Party considers the basic discursive line, the basic philosophical line seeking truth from facts as the secret of its success over the past 100 years. And I think we have to agree. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yan. Our time is limited, so we're going to fast forward to the next one. Now please invite Mr. Robert Griffiths, General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain, to share his insights through video.
And I must say, from the day I joined in 1983, I have never regretted it for a moment. You know, the cause of communism, the liberation of humanity, as Bertolt Brecht put it in one of his famous poems, the liberation of humanity is the finest cause in the world. And it's one that I've sought to dedicate my life. And therefore, you know, I'm also aware through that time of how many communists around the world have dedicated their lives to the cause of socialism and communism, and how many indeed have given their lives in the cause of socialism and communism. I have learned very much more in recent years about the tremendous courage and perseverance and sacrifices of the communists of China. And therefore, in this centenary year of the CPC, and on behalf of all of our members in Britain, I salute the Communist Party of China. I salute its membership, I salute its leadership, and I look forward not only to further great advances within China for the Chinese people under their Communist Party leadership. I look forward to great benefits coming to other peoples around the world. I know that the Chinese communists and their government wish to benefit from mutually beneficial relations. And I look forward to a strengthening, a further renewal, a second renewal of the international communist movement. And perhaps I'll finish by saying again, one of my great pleasures in recent years, politically speaking, is to see the increased role that the CPC is playing in the international communist movement. You know, we have our international meetings every year. We have our arrangements for coordination and preparation in between those meetings. And I think the way in which the Communist Party of China has come more to the fore, played a much bigger role in the proceedings of the meetings and in the organization and the preparation in between those meetings, and has stepped up its links and its relations with communist parties across the world, big and small. Even small parties such as ours are treated with absolute respect on the basis of equality and so on. I think the CPC is becoming a model as to how communist parties should conduct themselves in the wider international communist movement. So perhaps, you know, with that tribute, that would conclude my salutations to the Communist Party of China in its 100th year. I have certainly been to China 5, 6, perhaps 7 times. Deep impression left by my visit to Xinjiang and to the capital city, to Urumqi. Went on little walks from our hotel, one of the most wonderfully advanced, luxurious hotels I've ever been to anywhere in the world, by the way. But when we left the hotel and walked around the local area, people in Britain think we must have been escorted by officials or by secret police or something like that. Well, of course, that's absolute nonsense. We went out and we walked in the area locally. We went to local markets. And of course, we heard everybody speaking a language that sounded nothing like Han Chinese. They were speaking the Uyghur language. The officials that we met from the city government and from the party in Xinjiang and Urumqi, almost all of them were Uyghur speaking. They had to bring their own interpreters because our interpreters from Beijing did not speak Uyghur. So everywhere we went, we saw the Uyghur language on the signs, on the notices. We heard the Uyghur language being spoken. The officials we spoke to and had meetings with, almost all of them, in fact, I think all of them spoke in the Uyghur language, translated then for us into English and so on. And then shortly after we came back to Britain, I opened a copy of the Guardian newspaper and read a report of a speech in the European Union Parliament by the leader of the so-called World Uyghur Congress, which I think was then based in the United States. It's based in Germany now, in which he was telling members of the European Parliament that the Uyghur language was banned, that all the notices and signposts in Xinjiang were in Han Chinese only, and that all of the top officials were Han Chinese and not Uyghurs. Well, we had just been there. We had seen that this was the complete opposite of the truth. After coming back from Xinjiang a few years ago, I would never automatically believe anything I read or hear or see in the Western media about what's occurring in Xinjiang, because I've seen how that can be so completely misrepresented. So being able to take part in discussions and meetings in Britain and to tell people of this personal experience, I think I think it is quite important. I think one only has to look at the enormous economic and social advances of recent decades in China to understand that clearly, without going into the fine details, the general policy lines of the Communist Party of China and the government of China have been to the great advantage of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. You know, the achievement lifting 700 million people out of poverty, out of absolute poverty in recent decades. I think that is about, when one looks at the world as a whole, when one looks at the number of people who've been lifted out of absolute poverty around the world, China accounts for about 3/4 of them. So this is an achievement on an historic scale.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Griffith. 那么下面有请香港岭南大学高级研究员刘淑勇先生发言。May I invite Mr. Liu Shu, Senior Research Fellow of Lingnan University, Hong Kong. Mr. Liu, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. You know, my research area is on Hong Kong history, so I want to talk to you from the perspective of history. And I also want to talk about the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and Hong Kong. I think, as you know, after this 4th of May's movement, a lot of magazines of the maximum transported to Hong Kong. And we know 3 young Hong Kong people, Lin Changzhi, Zhang Rendao, and Li Yibao, set up the Marxist research group in Happy Valley. And Li Yibao is a primary school teacher. And these 3 people, they set up a magazine and to convey the Marxist notions. And also in December of 1920, Chen Duxiu passed through Hong Kong, and the 3 young people brought their magazines to meet Miss Chen Duxiu. After reading the magazine, Chen Duxiu encouraged these 3 people and encouraged them to establish a research group of Marxists. And after that, they set up this research group in Happy Valley. And in 1923, they established a Communist Youth League. And later, they also established a Hong Kong branch of the CPC. And in early 1925, Huang Ping is the secretary of this Hong Kong branch. Of course, we have a researcher with the same name, Huang Ping. As you know, industrial workers are the social foundation of the CPC. And Hong Kong seamen were among the earliest industrial workers in modern China. So early CPC members in Hong Kong attached great importance to conducting the party promotion among seamen. They made speeches to those people on multiple occasions and explaining the reasons for revolution. And you know, there are 2 large-scale labor movements in Hong Kong. And the first one is the seamen strike of 1922, and also the Canton Hong Kong strike of 1925 to 1926. The labor movement in Hong Kong, and they trained and cultivated a number of key members for the CPC, among whom Lin Weiming, Su Zhaozheng, and Cheng Yu and Zheng Sheng were the most and outstanding representative. And those are the outstanding leaders of the early labor movement in China. And Chen Yu served as Minister of the Fuel Industry, Minister of the Coal Industry of the CPC Guangdong Provincial Committee. And another people, Zheng Sheng, was the commander of the Dongjiang column in the anti-Japanese war. And after the founding of New China, he served as Minister of Transport. So those are the relationship between Hong Kong and the Communist Party in the early 80s. And in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched a party purge in Guangzhou. And we called it 15 April movement. And some communist members were arrested. For example, Xiao Chuyu were executed. So they relocated to Hong Kong because it cannot have any further movement in Guangdong province. And in the same year, the political bureau of the Central Committee of CPC and the first Guangdong Provincial Committee of the CPC was established in Hong Kong. And during this period of time, in the autumn and winter of 1930, with the support of the Southern Bureau and the Guangdong Provincial Committee, the Central Committee of the CPC set up a secret transport route to the Central Soviet area through Shanghai, Hong Kong, Shantou, and Yongding, because it's very hard for those people to go to the Central Soviet area. So they transported through the Shanghai to Shantou and the Yongding. And more than 200 important leaders, including Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng Xiaoping, Ye Jianying, Chen Yunbogu, and Ren Bishi, etc. They were transported to the Central Soviet area through this route. And this route was maintained until 1934, when the Central Red Army began the Long March. And after the outbreak of the anti-Japanese war in 1937, Liao Chengzhi set up the 8th Route Army Hong Kong office. And he also participated in the work of the China Defense League, led by Song Qingling. Since this establishment, the office received a large quantity of donated materials. And they also have these publications and overseas Chinese newsletter, and to update overseas Chinese on the anti-Japanese war. And many overseas Chinese youths returned to China to join the 8th Route Army. They did a lot. And during the anti-Japanese war, the CPC was the mainstay of the fight against the Japanese in Hong Kong. the Japanese invaded Hong Kong in December 1941, the British surrendered after merely 18 days of resistance. The Hong Kong, led by the CPC, and also those guerrilla brigade led by the CPC became the only armed force that persisted in the war of resistance to the very end of this anti-Japanese war. And they also participated in the secret campaign to rescue anti-Japanese cultural workers. And they are rescuing the Allied pilots and gathered intelligence at the same time. And during the Japanese occupation, 115 soldiers of the Hong Kong Kowloon Brigade died in this defending war, in defending Hong Kong. And in the early post-war period, the UK allowed the CPC to maintain a certain degree of legal presence in Hong Kong because they think there's cooperation between the CPC and the UK. You know, there's a liaison office of the central government, and its predecessor, it's the office of this Hong Kong Kowloon Brigade of First Army. So this is its history. And at that time, they wanted to establish their work surrounded Hong Kong. Therefore, Hong Kong has a multi-faceted roles. And in Hong Kong, this is a very important place for the culture and publicity for the anti-civil war and anti-dictatorship campaign. And this is also place of emergence of the democratic parties and their leaders. And also this is a place for the logistical support basis in the war of liberation. And in the end of civil war, Hong Kong had become the center of the new political consultative conference movement. And the democratic parties convened a meeting in Hong Kong to promote the convening of new political consultative conference in response to the call of the CPC Central Committee. So Hong Kong contributes a lot in the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And on the 1st of October 1949, the new China was established. And since the founding of the People's Republic of China, under the leadership of the CPC, and the China government didn't recognize the three unequal treaties imposed by the previous government. And those issues should be resolved through negotiation at an appropriate time. But the status quo should be maintained until the issue is resolved. So they had the special policy of planning for the long term and making full use for Hong Kong, which means they would proceed from reality respective way, and they maintain their status quo, maintained Hong Kong's political stability, and provide strong economic support. And after the People's Liberation Army arrived in Guangdong in October 1949, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai ordered the field army not to cross the Zhangmutou line. This is 40 kilometers north of Luohu, and send security force to maintain the security of the border. This is the political measures, and from the economic perspective, the supply of water to Hong Kong from Dongjiang River and the 3 express trains are typical examples. And this is also those are the economic support for Hong Kong from the CPC-led Chinese government. And this is also a manifestation of the mutual benefit between Hong Kong and the mainland. In order to solve the problem of serious shortage of fresh water in Hong Kong, and this water supply was in the shortage, and also in the year of 1963, at the request of the Patriotic Organization of Hong Kong, they got this water supply, and the shortage of water impacted the economic development of Hong Kong, and this water supply was closely related to the manufacturing. For example, the textile manufacturing, and for example, those patriotic organizations, and even British government, they proposed to the Chinese government to solve the problem by supplying the water from Dongjiang. Therefore, Premier Zhou Enlai ordered the construction of the Dongjiang-Shenzhen water supply project. And in the 1960s, Chinese government and even the Chinese people were suffering the natural disaster. But at that time, they still gave Hong Kong about 60 million. This was a large sum of money at that time. They appropriate this money to ensure the smooth progress of the first phase of the project. So this water was supplied to Hong Kong. For example, we have this water supply to Hong Kong, and this was accounted 150 million cubic meters of water were transported from the mainland to Hong Kong in 1997, and accounting for 82% of Hong Kong's water consumption that year. In addition, the Ministry of Railway and the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic, starting from 1962, they sent 3 express cargo trains for supplying frozen commodities to Hong Kong and Macau. And those price for the commodities were even lower than the price in mainland China. And this steady and balanced supply of cheap food from mainland, and coupled with this water supply, have kept Hong Kong's inflation rate and the labor cost lower than those of the developed industry country in the West, enhancing Hong Kong's competitiveness in the international market. And the relationship between the CPC and Hong Kong in the early stage can be roughly divided into 2 stages. Before the founding of the People's Republic of China on 1st October 1949, the CPC took advantage of Hong Kong's unique status to develop and strengthen itself, fighting against foreign aggression and work toward the founding of New China. And after 1949, the CPC took advantage of Hong Kong's unique status to promote the country's economic development. And also, they increase its influence in Hong Kong, and also an important factor in the economic takeoff and the stability of Hong Kong. Thank you.
公法教授来汉瑞先生是 of Professor of Public Law from Osnabrück University of Applied Science, Germany.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege to attend this important international symposium on the Communist Party of China's history of 100 years. Thank you very much indeed to the organizers from the Bohemia magazine for the invitation. From 1921 to 2021, it is hard to put into words what has happened in these 100 years in the world and especially in China. The pace of development in China is so dynamic, so rapid, that one is amazed and speechless over and over again. The resurgence of China as a leading global economic power, an innovation driver and future shaper is likely to be unique in human history. And therein lies the first central argument for the title of my presentation, which I formulated as a thesis. Why China is important, why we should know more about China, and what we can learn from China. We will only be able to understand tomorrow's world if we understand China. Anyone who wants to understand China has to deal openly and impartially with this large and proud country, its eventful history, its unique culture, and certainly also with the Chinese language. Anyone who wants to understand China must also deal with the political system in China and the Chinese constitution. And this includes, of course, dealing with the Communist Party as the central actor in the Chinese constitutional system. The Communist Party and its leading role in the Chinese constitutional system, that would certainly be a challenging question that could be dealt with in Germany from a comparative law perspective. Before I come to the question of what we can learn from China, I would like to outline 3 premises. First, an open and impartial engagement with China is not to be found that often, actually. Many have already formed a judgment without having undertaken the burden of intensive analysis beforehand. It is hardly surprising that such an unscientific approach leads to superficial and incomplete assessments that one quickly embraces prejudices or cliché-ridden images. Second, and this is aimed at the China discourse in Germany, we Germans in particular shouldn't walk around the world with our pointing finger raised, wanting to teach others what they have done right or wrong. Nobody likes to be reprimanded. That especially China is sensitive in this respect seems more than understandable, not least because China has experienced a century of humiliation by foreign powers, from the Opium Wars to the occupation of parts of China by Japan during World War II. As Germans, we are well advised to deal self-critically with our own history and our own historical misconduct. Moral rigorism is usually not a good advisor. This applies in particular to international relations. Former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder made a very clear statement in this respect just recently. Former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt had already urged renunciation of Western arrogance and respect for the oldest cultural nation in the world in his book One Last Visit, Encounters with the World Power China in 2013. Third, scientists have the task of generating new knowledge, driving innovations forward, and contributing to solving major societal challenges by asking critical questions and questioning things. But that does not mean that criticism should be an end in itself. Imagine a married couple celebrating its golden wedding anniversary. What do you think should be in the focus of their golden wedding celebration? Certainly, the positive moments and events, shared memories, and common achievements. Of course, we all know from personal experience that a long marriage is not all about good days. Nevertheless, it is a question of respect for the great achievements of the Chinese people that in an anniversary year, which is so important for China, one not only refers to problems, differences, and disagreements, but also honestly acknowledges the unimaginable historical success achieved in the process of modernizing China during the past decades. A few weeks ago, I published the book China Competence in Germany and Germany Competence in China at Springer Nature, together with my colleagues Hu Chunchun and Thomas Zimmer from Tongji Daxue. In her foreword, the former Minister of Education, Annette Schavan, emphasizes the importance of a trust-based diplomacy. When we welcome delegations from China at our university, we regularly experience that our Chinese guests speak excellent German, have excellent knowledge about Germany and its history, and are also experts on German discourses and developments in the respective discipline. In Germany, on the other hand, we know far too little about China, its history, its modernization, and current developments. The development of China competence at German schools and universities is therefore an extremely important topic. China has been Germany's most important trading partners for a couple of years now. Many German companies have had close economic relationships with China for decades. Conversely, Chinese-run companies in Germany employ a large number of German employees. Against this background, it is long overdue that we in Germany deal more intensively with China, just as we dealt with America after World War II. In his congratulatory letter of October 1st, 2019, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, the German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier emphasized the intensive partnership and interdependence between Germany and China. A year earlier, in a speech to students in Sichuan, President Steinmeier expressed the wish that many more people in Germany deal more intensively with China, with its history, culture, and language. By doing so, we could learn a lot, actually. Let me just mention 4 examples. First, we could learn from China to see in new developments, especially in new technology, not only the threat, but above all, the opportunities. When we look at megacities like Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen, we look to the cities of the future. China, for example, has succeeded in quickly getting the corona pandemic under control with modern technology, artificial intelligence, and big data, for example, through intelligent contact tracing. Second, former President Christian Wulff praised the Chinese enthusiasm for education in his inaugural speech in 2010. I personally experienced the hard work, the enormous discipline, and the real joy of learning in exchange with the students from Hefei Xuyuan and from Zhonghua Zhengfa Daxue, where I have the pleasure to teach as a visiting professor. Third, the Swiss sinologist Harro von Senger dealt with the Chinese art of long-term strategic planning in his book Supraplanung, Unrecognized Horizons of Thought from the Middle Kingdom. This would certainly be a beneficial broadening of perspectives for us in Germany too, especially when dealing with contradictions. And last but not least, the Chinese way of life, which is simply amazing and inspiring. In terms of international understanding, more direct contacts between Germans and Chinese would therefore be absolutely desirable. The peoples-to-peoples dialogue and the concept of change by exchange, the slogan of the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD, would benefit remarkably. I wish you a successful conference, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lechner. Now it comes to the end of today's event. I suggest we give a round of applause to our guests for their impressive insights. And thank you everyone to the International Symposium on the Communist Party of China's history of 100 years. At the end, let's say happy birthday to the Communist Party of China on your 100 years birthday, and we look for a better future. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.